In the year 1918, when the Siberian winter was at its coldest and the world was drowning in the chaos of revolution, a new horror began to stir in the frozen silence of the East. Soldiers from America, Japan, and Europe marched into Russia under the banner of the Siberian Intervention, believing they were there to restore order, to bring civilization to a land torn apart by civil war. But what they found beyond the Ural Mountains was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard of something ancient, something that had been sleeping beneath the ice long before mankind ever came. The deeper they went into Siberia, the stranger things became. Villages stood empty, fires still burning in hearths, meals frozen in place as if time itself had stopped. Horses refused to move forward. The air was heavy, thick with a scent of metal and decay, and the silence was so complete that the men began to whisper just to prove they were still alive. At first they thought it was the madness of isolation, the delirium of the cold. But on the third night, the screams began, echoing across the tundra, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The soldiers followed the sound, their boots crunching through the snow, until they stumbled upon a field littered with half-buried bodies, frozen in grotesque positions, their faces twisted as if they had died in unbearable pain. Then came the bleeding snow, dark red stains spreading from beneath the ice, warm to the touch, steaming in the cold air. The men were terrified, but orders were orders. They couldn't turn back. As they pushed forward, strange shapes began to move in the fog, silhouettes that looked human, but not quite. When one of the scouts vanished without a trace, the others swore they saw him again that night, standing in the distance, pale and barefooted, watching them with eyes that glowed faintly blue. The soldiers began to whisper about a curse. The locals had warned them before entering these lands. They spoke of the Morozny Aditya, the children of the frost, spirits born from centuries of blood spilled in the snow. These beings fed on fear, on the warmth of the living, and they woke when too many souls perished in the cold. The intervention wasn't just a political mission. It had become an invitation, a calling that stirred the ancient hunger buried beneath the tundra. Every night the screams grew louder, the fog grew thicker, and men began to lose their sanity, turning their weapons on each other, claiming they could hear whispers under their skin. What started as a campaign for power was now a descent into a frozen hell, where death itself took form and marched alongside them, unseen, unstoppable, eternal. As the Siberian intervention deepened, the soldiers' sense of purpose began to dissolve under the weight of unexplainable horror. Communication lines went dead, compasses spun aimlessly, and entire patrols vanished into the blizzards without a sound. The commanders, desperate to maintain control, blamed Bolshevik ambushes, but the survivors whispered of something far worse. Shadows that moved against the wind, footsteps that followed them even when they stood still, and eyes that glowed faintly beneath the snowbanks. One night, a Japanese detachment stumbled upon a Russian monastery half buried in ice. Inside, the walls were covered in ancient murals, depictions of tall, skeletal beings crowned with frost, surrounding human figures who knelt in submission. Beneath the paintings, the floor was littered with bones, hundreds of them, each one blackened, as if scorched from within. The priests who had once lived there were nowhere to be found, but their robes remained frozen to the pews, as though their bodies had evaporated, leaving only silence behind. The soldiers tried to document what they saw, but the film from their cameras would melt and warp, as though the images themselves refused to be captured. Their food supplies froze solid overnight, even when kept beside roaring fires. By the second week, the men began hearing their names whispered through the wind. Some claimed to see their dead comrades wandering outside the camps, calling them to come into the light. When a Czech soldier followed one such voice, his body was found days later, completely drained of blood, his face locked in a grotesque smile. The frost was spreading unnaturally fast, consuming everything around them. Even the fires, their only comfort, began to burn blue, giving no warmth. Those who tried to leave were found the next morning, frozen mid-stride, eyes wide open, staring towards something unseen in the distance. Then came the storm, the blizzard that erased the entire regiment. Witnesses from nearby units described it as a wall of white and ash, roaring like 1,000 voices screaming at once. For 3 days it didn't stop. When it finally cleared, all that remained were pieces of camp equipment and scattered human remains arranged in a perfect circle. In the center stood a single black obelisk, coated in ice but pulsing faintly as if alive. The locals who found it dared not touch it. They said it was the heart of winter, the prison of the frost children, cracked open by the blood of war. When Moscow heard the reports, they declared the region forbidden, wiping it off all maps. But secrecy couldn't bury the truth. Strange lights were still seen in the sky above the area, and those who ventured too close would vanish without trace. Years later, in 1942, a Soviet research team attempted to rediscover the site. Their last recorded transmission was a panicked voice saying, "They're still here. The ice remembers everything." Some say the Siberian intervention was doomed not because of politics or power, but because mankind trespassed into a land that was never theirs to claim. The cold was not a season. It was an entity, ancient and sentient, punishing intruders who disturbed its eternal slumber. The bloodshed of 1918 had fed it well, and the children of the frost, reborn from that feast, continued to wander beneath the permafrost, waiting for the next war, the next wave of souls to devour. And though history calls it a military campaign, those who have heard the forbidden stories know better. It was not an intervention. It was an awakening. The Siberian snow still holds its secrets. Buried deep beneath the frozen silence where no sun dares to linger, the soldiers who vanished there became part of the land itself, frozen memories trapped in eternal stillness, their souls whispering through the howling wind. The world moved on, writing the Siberian intervention into history books as just another failed campaign, another page of political tragedy. But history doesn't bleed, and the ground does. Travelers who wander too far into that region still report strange sounds at night, faint whispers in languages long forgotten, the creak of footsteps pacing around their tents, and soft knocks on the frozen earth beneath them. Some even claim to have seen ghostly figures standing motionless in the snow, their uniforms tattered and eyes glowing like shards of ice. Locals refuse to speak of that place, calling it the White Grave, where the living and the dead share the same breath. They say that when the wind blows from the north, it carries the voices of those lost soldiers crying out for warmth they'll never feel again. The frost remembers every scream, every drop of blood that melted into its soil, and every soul that dared to challenge its dominion. The truth of the Siberian intervention was never about victory or defeat. It was about awakening something that should have remained buried forever. Now, more than a century later, the ice still hasn't thawed. But when it does, when the world warms just enough to melt the frozen wasteland, what's beneath will rise again. And when that happens, the screams that once vanished into the blizzard will finally be heard. The children of the frost will return to finish what the war began. So if you ever find yourself in the heart of Siberia and you hear laughter carried by the wind, don't turn around. The snow is watching, and it never forgets.